On a blistering afternoon in Western Australia, a line of soldiers shoulders their rifles and raises to Lewis machine guns toward a dusty horizon. They are not facing an army of men. They are facing birds. Out in the shimmering heat, dozens of emus, tall, prehistoric shapes against the wheat, pause for a heartbeat, tilting their heads, as if listening. Then the order is given. Fire, gunfire, tears through the stillness. The Lewis guns rattle, brass casings spill into the red dirt, and wheat stalks explode in tiny puffs. When the smoke drifts away, the soldiers look up, squinting, and realize the terrible joke of it all. Most of the emus are already gone, vanishing into the scrub in a blur of feathers and dust. One gun jams. The truck they VE tried to turn into a mobile weapons platform lurches and buckles over the rough ground, far too slow to keep up. An operation designed to prove human dominance has, in its very first moments, revealed something else. Nature does not care how many medals you've earned. What no one knew at the time was that this surreal scene, soldiers firing on birds and losing, would become one of the most infamous punchlines in Australian history. They would call it the Great Emu War, but I know the truth. This was not a comedy. It was the end result of promises broken years earlier, of land pushed to its limits, and of desperate men begging their country for help, and getting machine guns instead. The Great Emu War, Part 1, The Land That Fought Back. If you drive through the old Wheatbelt today, out to Ward, where Campion once stood, you won't find much. A few ruins, a lonely road cutting through dry paddocks, and sometimes, in the late afternoon, a line of emus crossing the landscape like they've owned it for millennia, because they have. Years after the so-called Emu War, people would laugh when they first heard the story. Australia, they'd say, the country that went to war with birds, and lost. History books and trivia nights would condense it into a single absurd image. A modern army, armed with World War I weapons, outsmarted by a flock of oversized chickens. But out here, the joke dies quickly. The wind knocks dust against old fence lines. The horizon staggers under the weight of dry seasons past. There's no laughter in the empty town sites, in the abandoned soldier-settler blocks where men once gambled their futures on thin soil and government promises. By the time soldiers arrived with Lewis guns in November 1932, the punchline had not been written yet. What existed instead were three very real forces, on a collision course: desperate farmers, a fragile landscape, and a government terrified of looking weak. We won't start at the first shot. We start at the breaking point that made those shots inevitable. After World War I, thousands of Australian soldiers came home carrying invisible scars and very visible expectations. They had been told, serve your country, and your country will look after you. For many, that promise came in the form of land. The soldier settlement scheme carved the interior of Australia into plots, especially in Western Australia's Wheatbelt. Men who had survived Gallipoli, the Western Front, and the horrors of industrial war were handed blocks of marginal farmland around places like Campion, Chandler, and War. On paper, it looked like a fresh start, a chance to turn sacrifice into ownership, trauma into productivity. But the land had its own ideas. The soils were light and fragile. Rainfall was fickle. To make these farms work required not just hard work, but luck, money, and a climate that would cooperate. Then the Great Depression arrived. Wheat prices collapsed. Markets dried up. The same men who had once charged machine guns in Europe now watched their bank accounts hemorrhage as each harvest fetched less and less. They wrote to officials, pleading for subsidies that had been promised, asking for help to make it through one more season. Help was slow, explanations were many, money was scarce, and then, as if summoned by some cruel joke, something else appeared on the horizon: emus. Every year, after breeding along the coast, emus migrate inland, following food and water. In 1932, somewhere around 20,000 of them discovered the Wheatbelt. As soldiers settler farms, a landscape suddenly full of dams, troughs, and neat stripes of green crop. From a bird's perspective, this was paradise. From a farmer's perspective, it was invasion. The emus tore through fields, stripping young wheat, knocking down fences built to keep out rabbits, and opening gateways for yet more pests to flood in. A crop that was barely viable became non-viable overnight. Every stalk trampled was another pound lost, another loan at risk, another family standing at the edge of ruin. Imagine being one of those men. You have already survived shells and gas and the sight of your friends dying far from home. You've clung to the belief that this land will save you, that if you just work hard enough, the numbers will finally add up. Now you stand at the edge of your paddock and watch as a tide of tall grey birds marches through your wheat like it belongs to them. What no one in the cities saw were the nights that followed. The kitchen tables with ledgers spread open, numbers written and rewritten. The quiet conversations about whether there would be enough to last the year. The sense that the country you fought for was forgetting you. Again, it was in that state of mind, exhausted, humiliated, and cornered, that the farmers of Campion decided to take their problems straight to the top. In Canberra, the crisis in the Wheatbelt was a political problem as much as an agricultural one. Western Australian farmers were furious. The state was flirting with secessionist ideas, breaking away from the Commonwealth, claiming the federal government didn't understand or care about their struggles. So when a deputation of ex-soldier farmers travelled to meet the Minister for Defence, Sir George Pearce, they arrived with more than a complaint. They arrived with a request: send us the army. These men knew what machine guns could do. They had seen them on foreign battlefields tear through lines of men. If a weapon could stop a human charge, surely it could stop a flock of birds. Pearce listened. He heard stories of crops shredded, of fences ruined, of families barely holding on, and behind those stories, he heard something else, a chance to show that the government was at last doing something decisive. He agreed. The military would send help, but under strict conditions. The guns would be operated by army personnel, not civilians. The Western Australian government would pay for transport. The farmers would provide food, accommodation, and cover the cost of the ammunition. On the record, Pearce defended this as a humane, efficient way to deal with a serious pest problem, and he added, useful target practice for the troops. Off the record, some historians suggest he also saw it as a way to appease angry voters and undercut arguments that Canberra didn't care about the West. What no one admitted out loud was how strange this looked. A modern nation was about to deploy its army against wildlife. Not quietly, with a few rifles and no witnesses, but openly enough that someone had a bold idea: bring a camera. A cinematographer from Fox Movietone was enlisted to film the operation. That single decision changes how we must see everything that follows. If you are planning a low-key, practical cull, you don't need moving pictures. You only bring a camera when you need proof. Proof for Parliament, for voters, for your own reputation. In that moment, the Emu War became more than pest control. It became a performance. November 1932, 3 soldiers, 2 Lewis guns, 10,000 rounds, 1 camera. On the 2nd of November 1932, 3 men from the Royal Australian Artillery stepped down onto the red dirt around Campion. Major G.P.W. Meredith, Sergeant S. McMurray, Gunner J. O'Halloran. Behind them, crates of 303 ammunition and 2 Lewis light machine guns, veterans of another war. Ahead of them, a farming community that had pinned its hopes on steel and fire. Locals gathered, watching as uniforms stepped into their world. Some must have felt relief. Finally, someone with power was here. Others, maybe, felt a flicker of unease. Was this really what it took to grow wheat on this land? The plan, at least on paper, was simple. Use the farmers to herd the emus toward the guns. Let the soldiers open fire on dense flocks near dams and crops. Cull hundreds, maybe thousands, in days. Break the back of the invasion, then go home to applause. But the emus had not read the plan. As the sun slid down and the first flock gathered near a dam, the machine guns were set up. The men crouched behind their weapons, sweat running down their backs. Farmers moved wide in the scrub, ready to drive the birds inward for a breath. Everything was still. Gun bolts were checked. Sights were adjusted. Somewhere behind them, the camera prepared to roll. In that moment, before the first trigger pull, before the headlines and the mockery and the myth, Australia stood on the edge of one of its strangest experiments in power. Man versus bird, state versus nature, promise versus reality. The order was about to be given, and in part 2, you'll see what happened when the guns finally opened up, and the emus answered.